Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Matthew 25. Matthew is in the New Testament. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. And so the Old Testament starts with Genesis. The New Testament starts with Matthew. You say, what's the difference? Well, kind of in its simplest form, the Old Testament is before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. Matthew was a tax collector that was not very godly. He was not really following God. He was viewed as a traitor of his people. He has this encounter with Jesus. And he begins to follow Jesus, and his story is changed, so much so to the point that one of the eyewitness accounts we have of Jesus and his ministry and his death on the cross and his resurrection is from this guy named Matthew, that at one time in his life, people would not look at him and go, that guy's spiritual. Nobody would have looked at him and thought that until he begins to follow Jesus. And so right here we have this account that Matthew gives us of one of the things that Jesus said. And so in Matthew 25, I'll just read this to you right here. Starting with verse 14, Jesus is talking. He said, again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated. In other words, Jesus was showing us how his kingdom works. Now, there's more than just his kingdom. You know, there's the kingdoms that this world has set up, and there's, the Colossians 1:13 says that we've been delivered from the power of darkness and translated into the kingdom of his dear Son. And so we have the kingdom of God. If we're a Christian, then we're in his kingdom. But even though we may be a Christian in his kingdom, we can choose not to operate by the principles of that kingdom. We can operate by the principles of other, we can operate by our own principles. We can do our own thing. But Jesus was saying, this is how the kingdom works. In other words, so I want to speak especially to those of you that may be kind of frustrated. Maybe you're in a place where it's like, when is it going to happen? How is it going to take place? That this series over the next month is for you. And automatically when we think about this, we think about ministry and we think about church. But the truth of the matter is it can apply to so many areas of your life, because I've discovered this, that there are roles or callings that I have that God has given me. He's called me in his divine providence, by his sovereignty. He willed that I would be born into the earth as a man. And that he's called me to live as a husband to Tina. He's called me to live as a dad to David, Daniel, and Ashley. I'm a pawpaw, because baby boomers never use the word grandpa or grandma. I'm a pawpaw. And so, I have 5 grandkids, and then I'm called to be a pastor and a friend. Well, every one of those roles he's concerned about. So he said, in his kingdom, that one of the ways that I prove myself, if I want to prove myself in these roles in his kingdom, we're going to look at how we do that. So he said this is how it works. Can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money. Everybody say his money. To them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. So Jesus was saying, look, he said, this is how his kingdom works. He said, it's as if you've been entrusted with somebody else's stuff. Now, I've said this before, and if you come here very often, you're going to hear me say this a lot, because I think it's so significant to our walk, to how you and I serve God, to our relationship with him. And some people just don't realize, sometimes we don't stop to realize this, but God's entrusted all of us with something. Now, he's using money here, but I want you to know that's not really the context. We can prove ourselves faithful with finances, faithful with relationships, faithful with our time. But I want us to see, I want me and you, I want all of us to see in here that God's entrusted every one of us with something. It says that he gave to every one of his servants. Every one of them, he gave them something. Now, wasn't even the same amount. It was spread out based upon their abilities. And apparently they could grow in their use of their abilities, because at one time he gave the one guy 5, but he grew to a point that he could handle 10. And so you and I have been gifted with God. From God with things to do. Now you may be like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. That's why you should go to Growth Track. Growth Track takes place after the 12:02 service. We have a giftings test, because around here a win for us is we want to introduce you to a real relationship with Jesus. We want to help you discover your gifts. Whatever it is that God has given. We want you to connect with a small group, with a life group, because we believe that's where real change takes place. And then as you discover gifts, we want you to be able to serve so that you can make a difference in your world. And so go to Growth Track, man. They'll give you a giftings test. They'll help you discover. But all of us have been gifted with something. All of us, God has entrusted us with something. That each one of us, you have, I have, we've been entrusted with different things, different callings, different responsibilities, different things that He's called us to do. And they're unique in how He uses us. In other words, you may have the same gift as somebody, but He'll use you in a uniquely different way than He does them, even though you have the same gift. And so all of us have been given that. So Jesus said, this is how His kingdom works. So it starts with the recognition that we've been given different gifts. You have, I have, and you've got to discover what those things are. You're like, well, Pastor, I don't know. Go to Growth Track. Man, here's the thing I always tell people is that whatever it is you instinctively do, whenever a need arises and it just fits you like, I'm going to do that. That's probably connected to your gift. Probably connected to what you do. And so number one is this, is that each of us have been entrusted with different talents. Let's keep reading here. He said, the servant who received 5 bags of silver began to invest some money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, everybody say long time. Their master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they had used his money. So he was gone a long time and then he came back. Now, here's the thing that I think is interesting, and I think it's what God does with us. They had such liberty to use it that they could treat it any way they wanted. They could have used it for God's purpose, for His plan, and things He wanted to do. They could have used it for their own stuff, however they wanted to do, or they could have done like one guy did and not use it at all. Now, I know all of us are in different places in our walk with God, and the truth of the matter is that, I was brought up in church, and that may not be your story, and that's okay. I love the fact that we have different stories here. But because I was brought up in church, that, I just have different seasons of my life. But what I want you to know is that when the master came back, there was this time of accounting, of reckoning, where he came back and he called them together and he said, hey, do you remember when I left? I gave you those 5 things, and even though I let you use it, and I wasn't around to I wasn't sitting there just kind of eyeballing you and making, but you remember it was mine, so tell me what you did with it. And I think one of the things that Jesus is revealing to us here is that for all of us, that there'll be a moment, an opportunity to give an account for how we've used what He's given us. Now, this is a bit sobering. And let me just say this. I want to make sure that you get this. That this is not what saves us. He's talking to people that are already, they were already served. Like we're saved by our faith in Jesus, by what He's done. And so, I want to make very clear, because as we begin to talk about using our gifts, being faithful and stuff like that, we could, if we're not careful, we'll almost connect that to, do I have a relationship with God or not? The truth of the matter is that we can be Christians, and that sometimes as Christians, we're not always faithful with what God's given us. I know that when my time comes and I have to give an account to the Lord, and He begins to say, Rick, I know that you're here, and these gifts, that I entrusted you with, and I know they felt like yours at sometimes, but they were really things I gave you, because not everybody has them. But so tell me what you did with them. And there'll be parts of that conversation where I'll be like, well, like right here, I was kind of being selfish, kind of wanting to do my own thing, and I use it for my own benefit, my own gain. I was manipulative, whatever. And then right here, I didn't do anything with it. I just kind of hid it because I didn't feel like messing with it. But then they'll go, yeah, but then there's that one time that I see you right here, and nobody was watching. There was not a crowd. You weren't on the platform. It was just one of those things that it wasn't even convenient for you, but in that moment, I nudged your heart and you used my gift that I'd given you. Now, Paul wrote in his letter to the church at Corinth about the judgment seat of Christ. And the judgment seat of Christ, it's a place that Christians will go where we'll have that moment where He'll begin to ask us how we used our stuff. And so the word that's used there in the Greek is the word bema. And bema, depending on which culture, it had different uses based on the culture. But in the Greek culture and in the Roman culture, the bema was a platform where large gatherings of crowds would be, and they would begin to reward those that had done great things. In other words, they would say, and now we want to recognize General so-and-so for his great conquest. Come up here on the platform. And they would come up there, and the crowd would recognize him, and it'd just be a great moment. And so one of the things that will happen to all of us as Christians is that even though there'll be moments in my life where I didn't use my gift like I was supposed to, and there'll be other moments in my life where I didn't use my gift at all, but there'll be other moments where the Lord will be like, right here, you did this, and your motives were right, and nobody saw you, and even if they did see you, that wasn't why you did it. You just did it just because I nudged you, Rick, in front of all these people, get down here. And so to be a moment of recognition, as I was looking at different commentaries, they kind of connected it to whenever we recognize Olympic athletes for great performance, great accomplishments, how in front of all of their peers, they're presented with medals, they're presented with awards and achievements and recognition. And so you and I, for the gifts that we have on those moments, there'll be that kind of celebration. It's wild to think that there's 2 times that Jesus mentions there being a party in heaven. One is when people give their lives to Jesus, that all of a sudden, at that moment, he's so excited that like, I saw you lost, I saw you without me, I saw you broken. You turned towards me, let me love you and forgive you. We're celebrating up here right now. And then there's those other moments where we just unselfishly, just because we love the Lord, and even when it wasn't convenient, we used our time, we used our gifts and our talents. And it says that whenever we stand before the Lord and he acknowledges those moments, he's like, get in here, let's celebrate together. So here's the truth of the matter is that all of us have been entrusted with something. And we all, at some point, we all have to give an account. We'll all stand before the Lord. And even though we're Christians, and there'll be that moment of, hey, what'd you do with that? And again, as I replay it in my mind, sometimes it's kind of sobering because I've had seasons in my life where I didn't do what I was supposed to. But other seasons where it's like, God, my life's yours. These gifts that are yours, that you're entrusting me with, how do you want me to use them? And so we have an opportunity to be used by God. And for him to say, I saw you. I saw you help that person out when you had absolutely nothing to gain from it. I saw it. Get down here. I saw you at your job when you weren't being treated fairly. And people were not even saying the truth about you. But you didn't enter into and use their weapons. You fought your battles differently. I saw you maintain a good attitude. I saw you to still work as if you were working for me. And I know at times you felt invisible, but you weren't invisible to me. Get down here. I think about Stephen whenever he was stoned. That he was sharing, and a bunch of religious people got mad at him, so they started throwing rocks at him. And at that time, he probably felt so alone because they'd laid their coats down so they could throw rocks at him. And as they're doing that, the crowd's yelling at him. People are against him. He could probably feel so isolated and alone. And yet it says that he looked up into heaven just before he died. And up in heaven, he saw Jesus stand up. And I thought, when we're walking at our best, that the applause we seek is heaven's. Yes, sir. The approval we seek is heaven's. That if we may not, that's right. The world could give us a standing ovation, but if we don't have heaven's approval, then it's just a fleeting moment. We could be disapproved by the world, but if we have heaven's approval, I would rather have an applause from heaven than the recognition of the world. And so you and I, as we have an opportunity, we have to give an account for how God has used us for what he's done. And I think about that. Sometimes I play in my mind, what would that sound like? What will that conversation sound like for me? And for me, the journey's long. The journey's long. Like I said, there's some seasons where it's like, Lord, I'm sorry. I wasn't doing very good there. I didn't do right. I'm so sorry. And there'll be other times like, Lord, I didn't do anything there. But then he'll point out, yeah, but right here, you were turned towards me. And even when it felt alone, even when you felt like, am I invisible? You weren't. Hebrews 6:10 says this, that God is not unfaithful. He sees what we do for his people. He doesn't forget. He's not unrighteous. He's just. He sees what you do for his people. So number 2 is this, is that we will eventually give an account of what we do with the talents we've been given. We could, we can use them however we want. We can use them for our selfish purpose, not at all. We can do any of those things, but at some point when we go to him or he returns and we have that moment. Now, the cool thing about it is that if you walk with him, all of us will have those bema moments where it's like, I want to acknowledge you in the presence of all your peers. When you did that, I want to celebrate you. Get down here and get your crown. Get down here and get what you've done. Hey, you use your ability, use the ability I've given you and the gift I've given you. It'll be a great moment. I want to have more of those. Don't you? I want to have more of those. Let's continue reading and we'll close with this right here. He said this, after a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they'd used his money. The servant of whom he'd entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 5 more. The master was full of praise. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. There'll probably all sorts of music and stuff like that. They may even be doing the song Celebration. I can't imagine disco being in heaven. But anyway, so here's the thing. It says, the servant who had received 2 bags of silver came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I've earned 2 more. The master said, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. Then the servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I'd lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here's your money back. But the master replied, you wicked and lazy servant, if you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it. Then he ordered, take the money from this servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of silver. Here's the thing is that each one of them, as they gave an account, 2 of them, because they used them, bore fruit. There was things that took place as a result of them using the gifts that they'd been entrusted with for the reason that the master would have them use it. Now, the one guy, even though he held on to it, he wasn't referred to as faithful. Sometimes we say, well, you know what, I stayed. Well, you did, but what'd you do? What'd you do with it? And so here's the thing I discovered about faithfulness is that when you and I are being faithful, that faithfulness with what God has entrusted us with bears fruit in our lives. That whenever we use the gift that he's given us for the reason that he's given it to us, then it'll bear fruit in our world. That it's not just using it, but using it, you're like, well, how do I bear fruit? Well, use what God has given you for the reason that he's given it to you. Use it for that in every area of your calling. Again, my calling, a man, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a pastor, a friend, that in every one of those things, he's entrusted me with gifts for the roles that he sovereignly has placed me in. So I use the gifts that he's given me in those, then it'll bear fruit in my marriage. It'll bear fruit in my relationship with my kids. It'll bear fruit as a pastor in the local church. It'll bear fruit as a man and who he's called me to be and how he's called me to live out. I believe part of my calling is to awaken in men the rise and the call back to godly masculinity. It'll bear fruit in friendships that we have. So just these things that he just nudges us. And sometimes it's significant. Sometimes it's huge. Sometimes it's obvious. But then there's these other things that maybe to us, they really have no significant moment. I think about 2 different issues. One was in a way that God had used me one time. And then another was in a way that he'd used somebody in my life. I've shared this story with you. But years ago when I was doing youth ministry, a kid that would come visit from time to time, his grandmother lived in Clovis, New Mexico, which is where we were for 17 years. And I just remember one day, we took him out to get ice cream, and afterwards, I'd said to him as he's going back up the house, I said, hey man, I want you to know something. God loves you. He's not mad at you. And I thought that's kind of a weird thing to say to a 13-year-old. I mean, it just seemed, like, hey, I want to show God's not mad at you. I didn't know that in his story, he'd been molested before by 3 different men. And so as a kid, the only way he could process that is God must be mad at me or this wouldn't happen. not understanding that people that were called to do certain things weren't doing their role in protecting him as they should. And so when I just made this simple statement, God's not mad at you, it ministered so to his heart. It bore fruit because there wasn't a crowd. I wasn't doing it for approval. I just felt this nudge to do it. I remember years ago when I was going through depression and I was serving at a church and I was ushering. And back then, the place I was ushering at, they had different sport coats. And they would tell you, you're going to wear the black coat tonight, or you're going to wear the blue coat, or you're going to wear the red coat. And so I'd come in with these black pants, a white shirt, and a tie, and then they tell us whatever coat they wore. Praise God, we don't do those days anymore. But anyway, so I came in, and I was really going through depression, but I was doing my responsibility, doing the thing that just trying to serve somewhere. And just this weight of depression was on me. And I remember, so I pushed through serving, smiled at people, tried to prepare their heart for what God had for them. I didn't want to get in the way of what God wanted to do in their life in that service. And so after the service was over, man, I get up and I go back, and this weight is still on me. And I remember I took my coat off and I hung it up and stuck it on a hanger, get ready to go. And this guy came over to me. I didn't really know. We just ushered together. And he just looked at me and he goes, "We walk in complete victory." It was such a simple statement. But in this moment of darkness, for that moment anyway, it gave me hope. It encouraged me. This very simple act that was just less than 30 seconds long to communicate, that wasn't done with a microphone from a platform. It was done in the back room as we're leaving a place of serving where it was complete anonymity. There wasn't going to be a Facebook thing about it. It was just one soul to another, following the nudge of the love of God and speaking into that person's life. And I'm sure, just like me, there were times in his life that he used his words for ungodly purposes. I'm sure there were times in his life that he didn't speak up when he should have. But in this moment, this one simple phrase, he was faithful with what God had given him, and it bore fruit in my life. And even to this day, when I go through a hard season, I think about that moment, and here I am up here speaking to hundreds of people regarding that moment. And his simple phrase over 30 years ago is still bearing fruit today. Part of the challenge is because when we do these things, they just feel small to us. We don't know the impact they have on somebody else's life. We don't know what somebody else is going through. But we'll just be obedient to use the things that he's given me words, and I can use them however I want. And sometimes I have. And I could not say things when I should. And sometimes I have. But then there's those moments where I just feel this nudge, and sometimes it doesn't even make any sense. It's just to encourage somebody, just to give them hope. And it's amazing the fruit that those moments produce. I think one of the cool things about when we give an account is that there'll be things, I know there'll probably be things in my life that I thought were really a big deal. And as far as God's concerned, he's kind of like, eh. But there'll be those other moments that to me didn't carry much weight because I didn't know the impact that they had on an individual's life. And that God saw that I had to push past my understanding and things like that. And he saw all of that stuff and he's like, I want to celebrate this. And I'm like, man, Lord, that just seems so small. And he goes, in your eyes maybe, but not in his. So faithfulness bears fruit. When you and I do what God has called us to do, with the gifts that he's given us, then there's fruit that's born as a result of that. That it just yields forth things in our life. And it's one of those moments that when that happens, when we stand before the Lord and we have those moments, finally at the end he goes this, get in here and celebrate with me. Come on in, let's celebrate the things that were done and how you were willing to be used by me, even though it seemed like maybe I wasn't there. And even though at times you felt alone and unnoticed. And even though the pressure of people said, don't do that. Don't have a good attitude. Don't work as if you're working unto the Lord. It's okay. It's okay because how you're being treated. And you're like, no, I'm doing this for God. The Lord sees that. And that faithfulness brings fruit in each one of our lives. Number 3 is this. Faithfulness results in fruitfulness. I want us to do this. I want us to bow our heads and close our eyes for just a minute and just really just connect with God's presence. Let him begin to speak God thoughts and begin to stir us up and challenge us and make a commitment. Lord, I want to operate by your principles. I want to do things the way your kingdom does it. I see other people and they do their own thing. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that person. Let's just spend a moment with God. Let him speak to us.